Leopard flight of 4 F-4C Phantoms from the 47th Tactical Fighter Squadron out of Ubon were providing the MiGCAP for F-105s going downtown to strike a munitions factory near Langchi when they received an urgent call from a nearby EB-66C. Their display had just lit up like a Christmas tree. Multiple SAM radars and now guidance radars were on the air. The Phantoms were flying at 23,000 feet, about 40 miles west of Hanoi, when Captains Faubert and Kern spotted smoke trails rising up towards them. Bluebells ringing, came the frantic but cryptic call from the EB-66. Before they could figure out what they were looking at, or what the hell bluebells were, an SA-2 Guideline exploded a handful of feet away from their Phantom. The aircraft was flipped upside down and immediately began to come apart. The two aviators ejected. Both would be captured, but whereas Kern, a World War II B-17 veteran who had spent 9 months in Stalag Luft, would ultimately be released after nearly 8 further years in captivity, Faubert did not survive his incarceration. He was the first victim of the SA-2 Guideline in Vietnam. Its introduction would markedly change the nature of that air war and that of all subsequent conflicts. The presence of guidelines in Vietnam was not actually news to the USAF. In early April, a reconnaissance flight had photographed the recognizable hexagonal flower-shaped installation of a new SA-2 battery. Revetments for the missile launchers had been dug, connected by a road network. Clusters of radar huts and antennas were close by. 5 more similar sites had been identified when mid-July came around. An EB-66 had also picked up the telltale guidance signals from a 6th battery near Hanoi. Those guidance signals were the essence of the SA-2 system. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated weapon, and it relied on command guidance. A radar known to NATO as Spoon Rest searched for targets. When one was detected and a missile launched, the target and the missile were tracked by the infamous fan song radar. This sent the tracking data to a simple computer, and in turn that sent steering commands to the missile that attempted to merge it with the target. SA-2, or S-75 as it was actually called by the Soviets, had been intended to shoot down high-flying supersonic US strategic bombers, which travelled in relatively straight lines. It had never been intended to shoot at smaller tactical aircraft, and certainly not those travelling at high speed close to the ground. The 35-foot-long, 5,000-pound rockets were launched with a detachable solid-fuel motor that fired for 4 or 5 seconds, and then it was sustained on its interception course with a liquid-fueled motor which burned for about 22 seconds. Launches were therefore accompanied by a great cloud of smoke and dust, and the missiles were readily trackable from their smoke trail if they were seen from the side, or as a speck with a bright fiery plume around it if they were heading directly for the aircraft. Because of the weight of the weapon and the 2-stage propulsion system, it accelerated rather slowly. Maximum velocity was somewhere between Mach 2.5 and 3, but it didn't reach that speed until it was 25,000 feet up. Slant range was between 20 and 30 miles, and the missile's envelope was between 6,000 and 80,000 feet. In reality, the only way you were being hit at 6,000 was if you accidentally flew into the missile during its boost phase, which did actually happen to several VPAF MiG-17 pilots over the course of the war. Recognizing the lamentable accuracy of the system, the warhead was a massive 400-pound HE frag type. To give you an idea of relative power, the large warhead on the AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missile was 88 pounds. The AA-2 Atoll, carried by Vietnam's MiG-21s, was just 16 pounds. The Guideline therefore packed one hell of a punch. All of this information was known to US commanders, as they had encountered the SA-2 over the Soviet Union, where several missiles had brought down Gary Powers in 1960, and then over Cuba in 1962. In the latter case, Marine EF-10 Skyknights had been on hand to monitor the system's emissions and record them for later use. And yet, nothing was done about the sites because the US administration in Washington believed that the missile batteries were a gift from the Soviets to North Vietnam, and they could therefore not be attacked without offending Moscow. The process of regifting those missiles to the US Tactical Air Command began in July 1965. Actual use of SA-2s against their aircraft caused Washington to slightly loosen its intentions about the SAM sites. They now allowed sites to be struck if they could be identified by photos first, and they were outside of restricted areas around Hanoi, Haiphong, and the main VPAF base at Phuc Yen, also near Hanoi. Although these were obviously the areas where most of the sites were located, it was at least a start. The TAC and the Navy therefore began to consider how those sites might be attacked as quickly and as safely as possible. Their first attempt was clearly not the way to do it. On July the 27th, 54 F-105s launched a massive iron hand strike on a supposed SAM site. Unfortunately, the 236th Missile Regiment had anticipated this move, and they set up a decoy site surrounded by 120 anti-aircraft guns. They blasted the attacking thuds, shooting 6 of them down and then following up by shooting down the RF-101 Voodoo that came over after the strike had concluded. In the wake of these early disasters, Brigadier General K.C. Dempster was assigned to lead a task force intended to combat the threat of SAMs and the developing North Vietnamese Integrated Air Defense Network. Before he got going, the Navy had already quickly started to install radar warning gear on some of their A4s and A6s. SAM sites were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, as the early attempts at Iron Hand had demonstrated. This meant that simply flying low under the effective envelope of the SA-2 wasn't really a viable option. Most aircraft the US lost in Vietnam were of course hit by small and medium caliber bullets and shells at low levels. Jamming the sites was definitely feasible, and it would become more so as crash programs to develop ECM pods were initiated. But in the summer of 1965, such systems were many months and even some years away. There were insufficient numbers of existing jamming aircraft to protect every strike all of the time in any case. And ultimately, as one former Weasel pilot put it, the best form of electronic countermeasures is a 2,000-pound general-purpose bomb delivered onto the radar antenna. The first meetings of this working group in early August 1965 therefore immediately identified the need for a new type of aircraft, specifically intended to hunt down and destroy the radars controlling the SAMs. Without the radars, the missiles were blind and they could be attacked by conventional tactical jets. The working group also recommended that radar warning receivers be fitted to tactical aircraft going into the northern route packs as a matter of urgency. Development of pylon-carried jammers and an anti-radiation missile should also be rushed through. The aircraft is the main focus of this video, and as was so often the case in this period, the natural starting point for such a plane was to modify the readily available and well-understood F-100 Super Sabre. The Hun's relatively small size and lack of avionic sophistication meant that it was unlikely to be a long-term solution, but it was a quick one. With that decided, subcontractors were engaged at breakneck speed and without the usual oppressive red tape. There was a significant irony in this decision, as the Bendix Corporation had approached TAC with a proposal to fit radar warning gear to the F-100F in early 1965, but it had been turned away on the basis that it would never be needed. The Air Force had even tested a QRC-253-2 homing system against Hawk SAMs in a 1964 exercise called Goldfire, concluding that it worked very well. As it happens, development of this first tactical anti-SAM aircraft began at an opportune moment. Prior electronic reconnaissance and jamming aircraft had taken aloft large and finicky valve-based electronics. That meant using a platform like the Navy's A3 Sky Warrior or the Air Force's B-66 destroyer. Fine though they were, these were too large and too expensive to be used to sniff out SAMs around the battle area. But transistor technology enabled a revolution in the size, reliability, and cost of such systems. There was, however, an issue with accessing that technology. Namely, it was beyond top secret. Somehow, Dempster managed to convince the CIA to open up access to Applied Technology Inc., a small business who had developed a compact, transistor-based ECM system for the U-2. Incidentally, that is not the same ATI as the famous graphics processor company. A demonstration of the ATI suite was arranged alongside similar demos of the Goldfire and Bendix systems, and shortly thereafter, ATI received a $100,000 contract to develop a fighter-compatible radar warning receiver, missile launch detector, and a radar intercept receiver, plus all of the associated displays and control panels. Working around the clock, the ATI team got all of the kit ready on time and on budget. It was fitted to an F-100F, it worked, and days later, Dempster had the production line for similar units authorized and producing systems. The project needed a code name for secrecy and for cool points. After experimentation with various rodents, including ferret and mongoose, the task force alighted on the weasel. Cultural representations of the weasel vary. In the US, they are apparently regarded as fierce and fearless. In England, not so much. Development of the insignia was included in the ATI contract, providing a significant challenge to the graphics department, none of whom had ever seen one. The equipment, known as Modification 1778, was hand-built by ATI and installed in 4 F-100s by North American Aviation in Long Beach. Of these 4, 3 were perfectly functional and 1, tail number 581226, was generally regarded as a sick bird that never really worked properly. The installation was actually quite involved, as a great deal of wiring needed to be removed from and rerouted within the F-100F to make space for the new black boxes. This new equipment had 3 basic functions. First, it warned the crew that they were being illuminated by a fan song or the fire can radar that directed AAA. These facilities were provided by a combination of systems. The IR-133 panoramic receiver picked up weak signals in the S-band from long range in the forward arc of the aircraft via 4 antennas dotted around the nose. The signals could be analysed for frequency, which also told the crew whether the signal was from a SAM, an AA gun, or some other type of radar, and the repetition rate, which indicated whether the radar was in a search, tracking, launch, or guidance mode. By comparing the signal strengths on each side of the aircraft's nose, the EWO could tell the pilot to turn right or left to home on the signal. Test personnel thought at first that this technique could be used to determine range to the emitter through a quick triangulation, but small differences in offset made tremendous differences in range, and thus the technique wasn't practical in reality. Estimating the range to a site proved to be an insurmountable problem during the first stage of Wild Weasel. Alongside IR-133, a system called Vector 4, which was later redesignated AN/APR-25, detected the S-band or C-band search radar emissions and the X-band emissions used by GCI to direct fighters and gunners to aim AAA. Vector provided 360-degree coverage via 2 small spiral antennas under the nose and 2 antennas facing rearward on the trailing edge of the vertical fin. It could send direction signals to the CRT display, as well as indicate the nature of a threat via a panel of lights that replaced the Sidewinder missile control panel in the upper left of the pilot's front panel. The second capability of the Weasel equipment was to warn when a missile was about to be fired by sensing a power change in the L-band fan song command guidance radar. The specific piece of equipment was the WR-300, later designated AN/APR-26. It signaled a launch via a red light in the modified cockpit displays and was based on a crystal tuned to the guidance and control frequency. That bright red light was marked launch, and it would illuminate very brightly. It was difficult to miss and chilling to see. Remarkably, WR-300 had been developed based on intelligence about the power level change and a recording of a single missile launch that had been detected by an overflight of a Soviet missile range, yet it did actually work in practice. The third function was that Vector could automatically calculate the direction of the threat, enabling the Weasel to locate it. That bearing was displayed on a 3-inch CRT in both the front and the rear cockpits. As well as the detection gear, a Mohawk mid-tape 400 tape recorder was fitted to enable signals to be replayed on the ground. Provision was also made for a Ka-60 strike camera for post-strike intelligence gathering. The crew concept had the EWO concentrating on identifying and locating threat radars, while the pilot concentrated on flying the aircraft and searched visually for SAM sites. He would also be responsible for marking them for the following strike aircraft, and he obviously was the one who took evasive action against threats. Beyond this theory and testing conducted at Eglin between October and November 1965, there was no manual for the hand-picked crews that began to be shipped out to Southeast Asia on the 20th of November. Less than 4 months had passed since Leopard 2 had been shot down, and missile launches were now a once-a-day occurrence. Further refinement of the concept would have to be done in the field. Some of this effort might seem a little bit rough and ready, but massive resources were actually being thrown at it. Some of them must have been as top secret as ATI's U-2 equipment. While at Eglin, pilots were able to fly against a real fan-song radar, which had apparently been either stolen from somewhere or was being replicated by some other US system. Listening to its sounds on the IR-133 and seeing the signals on vector allowed the EWOs to stow those squeaks and pops away for later use. And use them they would. Consisting of 4 aircraft, 5 crews, 40 military support personnel and some civilian contractors, Weasel 1 arrived at Korat on November the 25th, 1965. The aircraft themselves took off on the ferry flight on the 21st. Their mission was so secret that although they were part of a stream of F-105s heading in the same direction, they had their own radio frequencies and a dedicated tanker. Bad weather made it a very long trip, necessitating a 3-day layover in Hawaii. After their late arrival, orientation flights began on the 28th. The crews were pilot volunteers in the front seat and bomber or EB-66 EWOs in the back. They had signed up without knowing what they were going to do. When they were told, the usual response was that it was a suicide mission. But get on with it they did. Their mission was very much regarded as a rather dangerous experiment. Its goals were not expressed in a traditional military manner, but rather as 8 scientific-looking bullet points. The crews were to determine the warning capability of raw equipment installed in the Wild Weasel F-100F aircraft, investigate the effect of jamming by friendly aircraft on Vector and IR-133 equipment, determine the homing accuracy of the raw equipment and the capability of the crew to place the aircraft within visual range of the target, develop tactics for employing the Wild Weasel aircraft against SAM defense systems, determine maintenance requirements and reliability of raw equipment, determine the organization and manning requirements for Wild Weasel operations, determine training requirements for flight crews and raw gear maintenance personnel, and finally test any additional equipment which may be made available for the system during the period of the operational test and evaluation. Their tactical approach in these early days was for the F-100 to tool around while the EWO listened for the sounds they had stowed away in their memories based on their experiences at Eglin. Early warning radars would make a deep groaning sound in the headphones. Appropriately, the missile guidance radars sounded more like angry rattlesnakes. The F-100F would fly at approximately 400 knots, with the F-105s that made up the rest of the Iron Hand flight staggered in elements behind them in an offset trail. Because of the relatively slow speed of the F-100F compared with the F-105, the thuds were forced to weave behind the slower aircraft to prevent from overtaking him. The search would take place between 4,500 and 14,000 feet, high enough to be out of range of small arms fire and to receive the fan song radiation, but low enough not to clutter the electronics with extraneous signals. If the Weasel received a workable signal from a fan song, the F-100F would turn towards the emitter and begin a gradual descent. This was an exciting and stressful game. EWOs had to do the math in their heads to triangulate the rough distance and bearing using the IR-133. With experience, they could get that bearing down to within 1 or 2 degrees of azimuth versus the 15 to 20 degrees of accuracy given by the automated calculation in vector that was displayed to the pilot. If the EWO could determine an accurate bearing to the site and a homing run was imminent, the Weasel transmitted contact to the flight to key the F-105 pilots that a fight was on. At this point, the Weasel could employ terrain masking to reduce the probability of the flight being acquired by the SAM site, but obviously this took away the Weasel's bearing to the target. The flight would remain at low altitude, jinking and banking around the sky, until it was necessary for the EWO to get another bearing on the SAM site. Having come from nice, stable flying bombers, the EWOs had to rapidly adapt to reading their instruments and making their calculations while under G-force and stress. If the electronics indicated that the flight was being engaged by a SAM, the Weasel transmitted "take it down" and the flight began evasive maneuvers to break the SAM's radar contact or to descend below the SA-2's minimum effective altitude. This placed the flight into the heart of the AAA envelope, and it also took away the Weasel's bearing information again. If the pilot saw the site before it was overflown, he initiated the attack by calling "tally-ho" to the thuds and marking the target. More likely, the Weasel ended up overflying the site due to the effective camouflage techniques employed by the North Vietnamese. So as the aircraft passed overhead, the electronics would indicate station passage, and the Weasel would begin a steep climbing turn in an attempt to visually acquire the site and begin an attack. Once the target had been seen, the Weasel would dive at the target, fire his marking rockets, and then allow the F-105s to finish the job. The first combat mission took place on December the 3rd, and it teamed the F-100 with a flight of F-105s. The F-100 would carry a full load of 20mm ammunition for their two M39 cannons, and a pair of Lao-3 rocket pods for target marking and attacking softer targets like the antennas and radar van. Two 355-gallon drop tanks completed the loadout. Later missions would also involve an RF-4 Phantom carrying a Vulcan cannon pod, providing a modicum of air-to-air protection as well as after-action photography. The Weasels would also eventually exchange their rockets for iron bombs to give them more punch. Soon, Weasels and their attendant thuds were accompanying every major strike package going up north. They flew 2 missions a day, responsible for the lives of the crews of upwards of 24 aircraft at a time. More stress. The danger that they were putting themselves in came into stark relief on the 20th of December. A Weasel, callsign Apple 1 and crewed by captains John Pitchford and Bob Trier, detected a SAM site while supporting a strike near Haiphong. But as they began to pinpoint the site, their F-100 was hit in the rear fuselage by a 37mm shell which mortally wounded the aircraft. Pitchford headed for the Gulf of Tonkin, but with the hydraulics now completely done for, the crew had to eject before they reached the coast. Pitchford was immediately captured, and he spent 7 years, 1 month, and 23 days as a POW. Trier was killed resisting capture. His remains were returned to the US in November 1982. Undaunted, the Weasels struck back, directing F-105s to flatten an SA-2 battery protecting railway yards at Yen Bai. The pilots, Al Lamb and Jack Donovan, were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their first SAM kill. The end of the year represented a good time to look back at the SAM threat. In the 5 months in which guidelines had been active, 180 had been fired, which amounted to about 1 a day. They were typically fired in small numbers, and their direct effects had actually been quite limited. 11 aircraft had been destroyed in 19,000 sorties. Kill probability was just 6% on launch, which didn't seem all that bad. The planners did start to wonder, though, what would happen if the North Vietnamese got more missiles and started to fire them in larger salvos. That speculation could wait. In February 1966, 3 more F-100Fs arrived in theatre. Shortly thereafter, the first batch of a new missile, the AGM-45 Shrike, also turned up. The Shrike was a crude weapon. 10 feet long and weighing 400 pounds, it homed on the SA-2's radar emissions. If the radar continued to broadcast while the missile was in flight, then the Shrike would follow the beam all the way to the antenna and obliterate it with a 145-pound warhead that exploded into 23,000 steel fragments. If the radar stopped emitting, then the missile would go dumb and miss. The first one was fired on the 18th of April at a fire can with unknown results. A few days later, another was fired at a fan song, again without clear result. Although the arrival of the Shrike marked an inflection point for the Weasel's ability to engage SAM sites, it also marked the end of the use of the F-100F as a Weasel. The Super Sabre was just too slow to survive in the high-threat environment north of the DMZ. It was too small to carry increasingly advanced avionics or lift the new ECM pods that were now being deployed. It didn't carry enough fuel to loiter far enough north to be useful, and unfortunately the aging jets and their experimental gear were fraying in the corrosive, rough-and-ready environment of the war zone. So while the last missions were being flown in the late spring of 1966, the next Weasel, based on the TAC's favourite F-105 Thunder Chief, were being readied for action. The first of these F-105Gs flew in January 1966 and they reached the theatre in late May. The last F-100 Weasel mission was flown in July. In the course of their remaining missions, the F-100 Weasels lost one further aircraft in a training accident on the 13th of March. The crew successfully ejected. Less than 2 weeks later, a Weasel, piloted by Major Clyde Dawson and Captain Donald Clark, was attacking a SAM site about 20 miles northeast of Vin when it was hit by AAA. It crashed about 5 miles from the site, killing both men. In the course of their short and costly deployment, the Weasels flew 112 missions, of which 44 were Iron Hand strikes and 35 were ELINT intelligence-gathering sorties. 9 SAM sites were destroyed in the course of their activities, representing a substantial proportion of the approximately 24 systems that the North Vietnamese received in that time period. The Weasels discovered some important technical aspects in the 6 months or so in which they were operating, like the fact that their raw gear would work even when EB-66s were jamming nearby. They also found out some crucial tactical lessons, such as the challenges of spotting a camouflage SAM site from the air. Target marking improvements would be needed in a follow-on aircraft, as would improved navigation and position finding equipment so that the sites could be identified and positions more easily relayed to the following strike aircraft. Although it could function to some extent in the presence of friendly jamming, a major weakness of the detection equipment was that it had been designed for self-protection of an aircraft, and therefore it was less useful in identifying threats to other parts of a strike package. Vector was also prone to false alarms, whereas IR-133 was hard to use when the aircraft was maneuvering because of the way in which bank angle and aircraft altitude translated into the bearings shown on the screen. Mission by mission, tape by tape, the small contingent of Weasels and their jury-rigged SAM-hunting jets paved the way for the tactics and technology that would be advanced and then normalized in the F-105G and then the F-4G, which would serve until after Desert Storm. Wild Weasel is thus another example of a vital mission pioneered by the unheralded F-100 Super Sabre.